No one expected this. For decades, the United States stood as the undisputed dairy power of North America, exporting billions of gallons of milk to its closest neighbors. But something has shifted. In an unanticipated move, Mexico, once the largest importer of American milk, is cutting ties. And in its place? Canada. Quiet, calculated, and unwavering. A multi-billion-dollar deal just changed the map of North American agriculture, and most Americans still haven't realized what's been lost. It wasn't always this way. After World War II, American milk symbolized abundance and trust. It was shipped around the world, canned and powdered, bearing the proud words, "Made in the USA." That label was once a promise of safety, quality, and a better future. By the 1990s, trade agreements like NAFTA bound the United States, Mexico, and Canada into a triad of economic cooperation. And for a time, it worked. American dairy dominated the region, feeding millions. Mexico became the #1 buyer of U.S. milk, over 20% of exports flowed south. But behind this success, something fragile was growing. While U.S. dairy farms grew in size and speed, questions started to emerge. What were American cows eating? Were hormones being used? What about ethical treatment, sustainability, and transparency? In the pursuit of efficiency, America had overlooked something essential: trust. Canada, on the other hand, didn't race. They built slowly, prioritizing clean supply chains, ethical farming, and traceability. While U.S. milk was mass-produced like gasoline, cheaper, faster, more abundant, Canadian milk was crafted more like wine. Slower, more expensive, but increasingly desirable in a world awakening to food ethics. Young consumers in Mexico began asking different questions. Not just about fat content or calcium levels, but about how the cows lived. Were they confined? Were they injected with growth hormones? Were they fed animal byproducts? These weren't fringe concerns anymore. They were becoming mainstream. And then, it happened. A shipment of American milk, more than 250,000 gallons, was held at the Mexican border. After 2 days of inspection, it was rejected. Not because of spoilage. Not because of logistical issues. But because it didn't meet new livestock standards. It was, for all intents and purposes, ethically outdated. Meanwhile, Canada had already signed a $3.2 billion dairy deal with Mexico. No press conference. No spectacle. Just results. A quiet pivot in trust. While the U.S. argued over tariffs and volume, Canada spoke a different language, one of sustainability, animal welfare, and emotional connection. They didn't just sell milk. They sold peace of mind. The numbers are staggering. In just 1 quarter, U.S. milk exports to Mexico dropped over 9%. At the same time, Canada's exports rose by more than 30%, the largest increase in over a decade. This wasn't an accident. It was the result of a deliberate strategy, and the U.S. never saw it coming. And now, the consequences are being felt at home. In Wisconsin, Iowa, and California, small family farms are shuttering. One farmer had to dump 8,000 gallons of milk into the earth. Another received a phone call that a 15-year export contract was canceled overnight. No explanation. No negotiation. Just silence. Over 6,000 small dairy farms have vanished in the past 3 years alone. That's 10% of the entire sector. And as multinational corporations grow stronger, the backbone of rural America weakens. While Canadian farmers operate under a quota system with minimum price guarantees, U.S. farmers are at the mercy of the global market. They absorb all the risks, and receive little of the protection. It's not just about exports anymore. It's about culture, identity, the soul of a nation. And America, for all its innovation, seems to have lost the narrative. Canada's model isn't perfect. Their milk is more expensive. Their production is slower. But the payoff is enormous. Consumers in Mexico, Europe, and Asia are willing to pay more, not for more milk, but for milk that means something. Milk that tells a story. That respects the animal. That honors the land. That values the farmer. In surveys, 92% of Mexican consumers said they preferred milk from countries with strict ethical standards. And 97% of Canadian dairy meets those expectations. In contrast, U.S. exports often lack traceability, and consumers are left wondering, what's really in this glass? Canada now exports to over 40 countries, including the most demanding markets in Europe and Asia. Their milk travels further, costs more, and yet sells faster. Because it comes with a promise. Meanwhile, in the United States, that promise has faded. Milk has become just another commodity. A number on a spreadsheet. A bulk shipment on a truck. Forgotten the moment it leaves the farm. But behind every gallon are real people. A third-generation farmer who watched his father struggle, and now watches his own children question their future. Families who once took pride in feeding the nation, now wondering if anyone still wants what they produce. And here lies the silent crisis. If a country can no longer protect its farmers, can it still call itself stable? If a nation's food system prioritizes volume over values, will consumers still believe in it? The U.S. government continues to issue subsidies and relief packages, but most of that money flows to giant dairy conglomerates, not to the independent families losing their livelihoods. Farmers don't want handouts. They want purpose. A future. A system that believes in them. Canada made a different choice. They invested in people. In ethics. In the long game. And now, they're reaping the benefits, not just financially, but culturally. America can still recover. But it must change course. It must invest in transparency. In sustainability. In values. It must slow down and listen, not to the markets, but to the people. Because in the end, milk is more than a product. It is a mirror. It reflects what we believe in, and how we treat each other. The world still needs milk. But not at any cost. Not anymore. And so, when Mexico turned to Canada, it wasn't just about dairy. It was about direction. About which country truly understands what the future demands. Not just scale, but soul. Not just production, but trust. The United States still has the talent, the land, and the heart. But the question is, will it have the will to tell a new story? While American officials scrambled for explanations, Mexico's Agriculture Secretariat released a quiet but pointed statement. It noted that future food partnerships would prioritize environmental sustainability, animal welfare, and fair trade values. No mention of the U.S. No criticism. Just a shift in language, enough to send shockwaves through Washington's trade apparatus. At the same time, Canadian diplomats were already signing secondary agreements in Mexico City, not just for milk, but for cheese, butter, and long-term educational exchanges in food technology. It wasn't just a trade deal. It was cultural alignment. A reshaping of North American food policy, without America in the room. And Donald Trump? He erupted. In a late-night Truth Social post, he blamed Canada for poaching U.S. partners, accused Mexico of disloyalty, and promised new tariffs on dairy imports from both nations. But the markets didn't blink. Canadian dairy exporters had already rerouted supply chains. Mexican distributors had secured 5 years of product guarantees. The U.S. was yelling into an empty room, and no one was listening anymore. In the Midwest, dairy cooperatives began collapsing. A 75-year-old processing facility in Ohio shut its doors. In Vermont, small farms that survived generational droughts and recessions closed after losing their final export contracts. In Pennsylvania, protest signs appeared along rural highways. Got milk? Not anymore. The damage extended far beyond economics. Schools that relied on local dairies struggled to meet nutritional requirements. State food programs were forced to renegotiate contracts, often at higher costs. The federal government's silence, or worse, deflection, only deepened the sense of abandonment. Meanwhile, Canada rolled out a new marketing campaign across Latin America. Milk with Integrity, featuring multilingual packaging, QR codes for farm of origin tracking, and farmer profiles. The message was subtle but powerful: trust us, not them. In response, the U.S. launched counter-ads emphasizing volume, speed, and price, but they missed the point. Global consumers no longer wanted cheap. They wanted clean, ethical, and transparent. The conversation had changed. The U.S. hadn't. Even within Congress, fractures grew. A bipartisan group of lawmakers from dairy-heavy states demanded hearings. One senator called the situation an agricultural 9/11. Another warned that if America couldn't protect its core exports, then no industry was safe. And then came the ripple effects. China, observing the shift, began importing more Canadian dairy. The EU followed, citing compatibility with their own ethical standards. Africa's emerging middle class, long considered a growth market for U.S. dairy, began forming direct partnerships with Canadian cooperatives instead. It wasn't just a trade failure. It was a branding collapse. The label, American Dairy, no longer held the weight it once did. The stars and stripes on packaging no longer guaranteed trust, safety, or pride. They now raised questions and doubt. In small towns across the U.S., families who once proudly poured American milk into cereal bowls now found it replaced by imported alternatives. Parents began reading labels more closely. School cafeterias adjusted menus. Even military bases, once strictly domestic in sourcing, quietly transitioned to blended dairy providers. What started as one trade deal had become a national identity crisis. And yet, the government response remained reactive. More tariffs. More bailouts. More rhetoric. No innovation. No structural reform. The machine kept turning, but the world had moved on. Back in Mexico, consumers celebrated the transition. Social media campaigns praised the Canadian milk standard. Influencers visited farms in Alberta, broadcasting lush pastures and humane conditions. Children in Mexican schools took part in dairy awareness days, funded by Canadian export councils. The next generation of buyers was already loyal. And what of the U.S.? It kept exporting. But to fewer countries, for less money, with shrinking margins. The backbone of rural America, once built on food and faith, was quietly crumbling. The silence in Washington was deafening. The outrage from Trump, though loud, rang hollow. Because no amount of fury could undo what had already happened. Mexico had chosen another path. And others were following. This is only the beginning. Across the border in Canada, a quiet confidence was taking root. Their farmers weren't boasting, and their government wasn't gloating. They didn't need to. The numbers spoke for themselves. Dairy exports to Mexico had doubled in less than a year. Profit margins were up. Consumer satisfaction in Latin America reached record highs. While U.S. farmers protested and politicians shouted, Canada simply delivered. In Manitoba, a cooperative that once relied solely on domestic sales now had waiting lists from distributors in Mexico City and Guadalajara. In Quebec, dairy processors were operating at full capacity, expanding warehouses and hiring more workers. A rare sight in a global economy strained by recession. And in Ottawa, trade officials were already drafting similar deals with Brazil, Chile, and even parts of Africa. Meanwhile, American dairy policy remained locked in a decades-old model, based on subsidies, volume, and outdated consumer assumptions. U.S. farmers were told to stay competitive, yet given no new tools, no innovation funding, and no global marketing plan. They were expected to fight a modern battle with antique weapons. And still, Trump raged. At a press event in Ohio, he blamed Canadian betrayal for the crisis. He threatened sweeping tariffs on northern goods, called for investigations into Canadian trade practices, and suggested that Mexico was being manipulated by Trudeau's socialist agenda. But the audience didn't cheer. The farmers in that room had heard it all before. Words didn't restore markets. Fury didn't bring contracts back. And anger didn't pay the bills. In Washington, silence turned into confusion. Some advisors pushed for retaliatory tariffs, others begged for diplomacy. But behind closed doors, even insiders admitted, the U.S. had no leverage. Mexico was moving on. Canada had already replaced what America lost. And the clock couldn't be turned back. As the months passed, U.S. dairy prices collapsed. Thousands of gallons were dumped again. Suicide hotlines in rural areas reported record calls from distressed farmers. An entire way of life, one rooted in hard work, pride, and generational continuity, was vanishing in real time. And no one in Washington had a plan to stop it. Worse still, other sectors began to take note. If the U.S. couldn't protect its dairy industry, what about poultry? What about grains? What about beef? The precedent had been set. Canada had cracked the code: ethical branding, slow diplomacy, and consumer trust. And Mexico had validated it. Suddenly, U.S. trade dominance didn't look inevitable, it looked fragile. Even American consumers began to shift. Grocery chains introduced Canadian imports in high-end sections. Urban markets in New York and Los Angeles promoted grass-fed, ethical Canadian milk as premium lifestyle choices. It was no longer just about foreign sales, it was about domestic perception. And the U.S. was losing that battle too. What was once dismissed as a simple export contract had become something far larger, a turning point. A signal that America's agricultural supremacy was no longer guaranteed. That values, not volume, now defined the future of food. And as more nations signed onto Canada's Ethical Supply Chain Initiative, a quiet revolution was taking shape. Trade wasn't just about numbers anymore. It was about trust. And America, for all its wealth and reach, had lost it. Behind closed barn doors and on empty supermarket shelves, the consequences were real. A family farm in Indiana, passed down for 90 years, auctioned its final cattle. A dairy school in Minnesota canceled its next semester. A cheese plant in Kansas filed for bankruptcy. These were not just economic failures. They were cultural funerals. And through it all, the same question echoed again and again. How did it happen? How did the most powerful agricultural system in the world lose to a smaller, slower, quieter neighbor? The answer wasn't sabotage. It wasn't betrayal. It was neglect. Of the market. Of the message. Of the farmers. And of the future. America still produces more milk per capita than any nation on Earth. But production alone no longer matters. What matters is meaning. What matters is trust. What matters is that someone, somewhere, cares not just about the product, but about the people behind it. Canada proved that. Mexico endorsed it. The world is following. And now, the United States faces a choice. Continue down the path of denial and decline. Or pivot. Listen. Learn. Evolve. Because the truth is, dairy was only the first domino. And this is only the beginning.